The beginning of Mary's problems with the public began shortly after she came to the throne and announced her intention to find a husband.
Hi everyone, it's Margot here with another episode of Crown and Kingdom. The name Bloody Mary usually refers to one of three things: a ruthless, murdering woman, a creepy game played in the dark in front of a mirror, or a socially acceptable way to consume alcohol in the early hours of the morning. I know which one I prefer. As for who Bloody Mary was, the nickname is usually given to Queen Mary I, who ruled England for just over 5 years in the 16th century. But how did she get this nickname? And just how bloody was she, really? Well, let's find out.
Mary was born in Greenwich Palace on the 18th of February, 1516, the daughter of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Despite the fact that Henry and Catherine would be married for over 20 years, and Catherine would get pregnant at least 6 times, Mary was the only one of their children to survive infancy. Despite the disappointment of her arrival as a girl rather than a boy, Mary was doted on by both her parents and received an excellent education. By the age of 9, she could speak, read, and write in English, Spanish, French, and Latin, and was an adept musician. She was also an excellent dancer, an important trait in the Tudor court, and her father enjoyed showing off her talents to visiting ambassadors. An oft-told tale is that when Mary was a young girl, Henry even let her sit on his knee at important council meetings. The king was overheard to brag about her talents and good behavior, saying even as a baby she never cried, and he referred to her as the pearl of the kingdom. In 1525, Henry even made the incredible decision to treat Mary as the Princess of Wales, a title usually given to the king's eldest son. He installed her in her own court in Ludlow Castle, and gave her the authority to rule over the Council of Wales and the Marches, making her the first female to rule over both. Despite the fact that she was never formally invested as such, many at court referred to her as the Princess of Wales, and it seemed to all that she was being set up to one day rule the country. So, it is easy to imagine the shock and upset she must have felt in 1527, when she was informed that her father was attempting to break with the Catholic Church, cast her mother aside, declaring their union invalid, and marry another woman, all with the hope of siring a son who could then supplant Mary both in her father's eyes and in her position within the kingdom. On both accounts, Henry would be successful. In 1533, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, formally announced the marriage of Henry and Catherine to be invalid, owing to Catherine's previous position as wife of Henry's older brother, rendering Mary the cast-off child of a now illegitimate union. Cranmer also announced Henry's position as the supreme head of the Church of England and declared the abolition of Catholicism, Mary's faith, throughout the entire country. Mary was stripped of her title, referred to now as only the Lady Mary, and was removed from the line of succession. Her servants and friends were all dismissed, her household dissolved, and she was sent to live with her new half-sister, the Princess Elizabeth, at Hatfield, as a member of her baby sister's staff. Around this time, Mary began to experience periods of depression and menstrual issues which would plague her for the rest of her life. Mary had gone from being a spoiled and beloved child, a respected princess, and a pious Catholic, to being publicly denounced as, quote, the bastard fruit of an incestuous union, abandoned by her father and usurped by her new half-sister, Elizabeth. However, Mary abjectly refused to acknowledge both her father's new position as head of the church and his marriage to Anne Boleyn. In retaliation, Henry would remove all her creature comforts and forbade her from seeing her own mother, even when Catherine was on her deathbed. Relations between father and daughter were so fraught that they did not speak to one another for 3 years. By 1536, Anne Boleyn had fallen from power, was beheaded, and Henry had found himself a new wife, Jane Seymour. Mary's half-sister was too declared illegitimate. One wonders if Mary felt an inkling of glee when that commandment came down. Her new stepmother, however, was keen to repair the rift between father and eldest daughter. But in order to reconcile with Henry and find her way back into court, Mary was asked to sign a document that recognized her father as head of the Church of England, acknowledged that his marriage to her mother had been unlawful, confirmed her own illegitimacy, and denied all papal authority. In pure anguish and desperation, Mary signed it. Immediately, her place at court was reinstated, her household with full staff was reassembled, and she was gifted several palaces to use at will. She also gained access to the money that her father had firmly refused to send to her in the previous 3 years. Her accounts show immediate expenditure on household goods, new clothes, and gambling, the Tudor equivalent of your Catholic aunt who spent her evenings in the bingo hall.
30. 30.
Jane Seymour would die in 1537, shortly after giving birth to Henry's longed-for male heir, Edward. Mary was chief mourner at her stepmother's funeral and was made godmother to her new half-brother. Despite this, however, she remained out of the line of succession. Speaking on the topic, she described herself as, quote, the unhappiest woman in all of Christendom, which is what I said when they finally cancelled Once Upon a Time. Mary would see her father marry 3 more women, and it was the final one, Catherine Parr, after months of valiant effort and discussion, who managed what nobody else had, the restoration of Mary and Elizabeth into the line of succession, after the younger brother, of course. A portrait was commissioned at this time to show Henry with all 3 of his children and heirs, as well as his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, noticeably leaving out the woman who had managed to bring them all back together. But I digress. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Mary's half-brother came to the throne as King Edward VI. A staunch and vocal Protestant, he had relentlessly mocked Mary for her Catholic faith during the time they had lived together. Upon his succession, therefore, Mary withdrew from court in order to practice her Catholicism more quietly. However, this didn't stop her brother from repeatedly sending her demands to renounce her faith and convert, or risk her removal from both Edward's will and the line of succession yet again. This ultimately culminated in a public event on Christmas Day in 1550, where Edward reduced both Mary and himself to tears when, in front of an assembled court, he shouted at her for ignoring his rules regarding worship. But what's Christmas without a family argument? The royal family, they're just like us. 3 years later, the problem would resolve itself when Edward died at the age of 15 without producing an heir of his own. As Edward lay on his deathbed, the English crown seemed to teeter between Protestant and Catholic factions and various family claims. In his final act, Edward attempted to exclude Mary from the succession, instructing that the crown should go to their cousin, the Protestant Lady Jane Grey. It likely never entered into his mind that his sister was about to pull off the only successful coup d'etat of 16th century England. Shortly before Edward died, Mary had been summoned to visit him at Greenwich, but was secretly warned that this was, in fact, a ruse, an attempt to capture her and clear the way for Jane to take the throne. Instead of London, Mary fled to East Anglia, to one of her many estates. Meanwhile, before word of Edward's death had even been announced, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, a member of Edward's inner circle, went to the Tower of London and secured the fortress. He then announced the death of the king and declared his daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, as queen. Mary gathered her supporters at Framlingham Castle. In addition to a number of nobles, as well as countless suppressed Catholics, opponents of the Duke of Northumberland had also congregated there. As Mary traveled to London to claim her crown, the number of those marching beside her grew. It would seem that Edward and his advisors had massively underestimated the popularity of his older sister, as well as the public's belief in her as the rightful heir to the throne. Sensing the turning tides, Northumberland's support fell apart, and on the 19th of July, Jane was overthrown. She and her family were imprisoned in the Tower of London, and Mary was declared queen. On the 3rd of August, 1553, she triumphantly entered London, followed by a procession of over 800 nobles, including supportive members of her own late brother's Privy Council, as well as her half-sister, Elizabeth. Contemporary reports tell us that people celebrated in the streets and bells were rung across the country at Mary's accession to the throne. However, despite an initial proclamation that she would not, quote, compel or constrain the public to return to Catholic doctrine, hoping that her subjects would use their own hearts and minds to return to the true faith, Mary wasted no time imposing her own brand of religious rule. Catholic Mass returned to church on the very day she was proclaimed queen. Her first act as regent was to release notable Catholics like Edward Courtenay, Thomas Howard, and Stephen Gardiner from their imprisonment within the Tower of London, and at her first meeting of Parliament, Mary set about undoing all the religious legislation that had been put in place by her brother. Reforms were undone, Protestant clergy were removed from their posts, and bishops loyal to Rome quickly took their place. Prominent Protestant churchmen, such as John Bradford, Hugh Latimer, and John Hooper, were all imprisoned. Clerical celibacy was reaffirmed, and married priests were stripped of their retainers. After a year of negotiation, the Pope accepted England back into Catholic jurisdiction, and heresy acts, repealed during the reign of Henry VIII, were revived, turning the practice of any religion other than Catholicism into a crime. The first executions would begin within a month. The beginning of Mary's problems with the public began shortly after she came to the throne and announced her intention to find a husband. At age 37, she had little time to spare, and knowing her heir, the Princess Elizabeth, was no friend to Catholicism, Mary desperately wanted to have a child, not only to inherit her crown, but to maintain Catholic supremacy throughout the country. Parliament requested that Mary wed an Englishman, her second cousin, Edward Courtenay, or another relation, Reginald Pole. But Mary's first cousin, King Charles V of Spain, suggested his son Philip, who was, at the time, considered to be the most eligible bachelor in Europe, as a match for the new English queen. Believing that the safety of the country necessitated a powerful alliance, and to the shock and dismay of her counselors, about half her closest allies, and much of the public, Mary accepted the proposal. The two were wed on the 24th of July, 1554. The Spanish marriage had a disastrous effect on Mary's public standing, despite the fact that the marriage contract was, quote, favorable as possible for the interest and security and even the grandeur of England. People feared that, as a woman, Mary would have to submit to the male head of the household, which meant the King of Spain could exert undue influence over the country as her father-in-law. Rumors of a Spanish invasion began to swirl as it was announced that Philip would be styled King of England, and that Parliament would be subject to their joint authority. Although there was public opinion at the time, and even now, that Mary put the well-being of her country to the side in order to marry somebody she truly loved, it is worth pointing out that for both husband and wife, this marriage was politically advantageous, and whatever love was there seemed to largely be one-sided. Philip was quoted multiple times stating that he did not find his wife attractive, saying, quote, "The marriage was concluded for no fleshly consideration." Romantic. Philip spent little time with his wife, especially once he became King of Spain in 1556. He would come to England to do his duty and then leave as soon as possible. Although Mary believed herself to be pregnant twice, even taking to her rooms in preparation for the birth of a baby, humiliatingly, the couple remained childless. Eyewitness accounts talk of Mary staring out of the window after her husband had returned to Spain, and spending weeks anticipating his return. I think the relationship is best summed up in Philip's own words from a few years down the line. The Spanish king was in Brussels when his wife died, and upon being told of her passing, he said he felt, quote, a reasonable regret for her death. Ouch. One of the largest reactions to Mary's Spanish marriage was Wyatt's rebellion in January of 1554. Named after the leader of the rebels, Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, the rebellion was spearheaded by 4 insurgents: Wyatt, Sir James Croft, MP Sir Peter Carew, and the Duke of Suffolk, Henry Grey, father of Lady Jane Grey. Beginning in Kent, the rebels marched on London, amassing a force of 15,000 men. The Queen was encouraged to leave the capital, but she abjectly refused. Instead, in a remarkable move, she delivered a rousing public speech at the Guildhall, labeling Wyatt as a traitor to crown and kingdom. TM. She publicly defended her religion as well as her marriage, stating she was firstly married to the people of England, and that she did not claim to have the qualities of a man, but that she did have defiance, courage, and commitment as a woman. If you're ever wondering where Queen Elizabeth got the inspiration for her far more famous speech at Tilbury in 1588, look no further. Her speech was so impassioning that she had an estimated 25,000 people willing to pick up arms to defend her by the next day. The wave of support overwhelmed Wyatt and his followers, and the rebellion was effectively quashed. Now realizing that she had serious opposition, who were willing to go as far as attempting to depose of her, Mary began to look at leniency for her enemies as a dangerous notion. She ordered the execution of the rebels, And, knowing there were Protestant factions who would prefer to see her sister on the throne, Mary had Elizabeth imprisoned in the Tower of London. She also, reluctantly, ordered the execution of Lady Jane Grey to give Protestants one less figurehead to rally around. Then, the burnings began. Before I delve deeper into this, it's important to understand the context of religious belief in the 16th century. At that time, a person's individual faith was not a private matter, nor was it considered a philosophical position as some view it today. Religion was a strict guideline that ruled over every part of a person's life, their adherence to the law, their education, their relationships, and their politics. Religious policy was political policy, and disagreeing with one meant disagreeing with the other, which could easily bring about charges of treason and heresy. Also, in a vastly religious country, the majority of people believed that their eternal salvation was entirely reliant on correct religious practice. Being prevented from exercising one's faith was damnation, and religion represented the very highest of stakes. The wave of Protestantism sweeping through Europe was spreading outrage and fear as the very fabric of society seemed to be ripping apart. People were fearful not only for their own souls, but for those of their loved ones as well. And, unfortunately for many in England, Mary now viewed them as her loved ones, and she felt it was high time to show them the light. Which I honestly didn't intend to be a horrible pun, but there it is. Viewing Protestant dissent as a political threat that challenged both the legitimacy of her government as well as the authority of the Catholic Church, Mary believed religious uniformity was the only way to guarantee national stability. Fearful of another rebellion, she set out to make an example of her enemies, utilizing the return of the heresy laws to sentence dissenters and objectors to both her rule and her faith to death. The public executions Mary decided to carry out would serve two purposes. Firstly, they would be a demonstration that Catholic orthodoxy would be defended without compromise, and, secondly, they would terrify people into either conforming to the true faith or leaving the country, either way, bringing Catholic control back to England's religious life. Public executions were not at all rare, and were, for many, considered quite a nice day out. Pack a picnic, bring the kids. But these executions would be different. Instead of hanging or beheading, the heretics, as Mary saw them, were to be burned to death. You see, having your head cut off gives you no time to think about what you've done, while a slow death by fire could give you plenty of time to think about your religious beliefs and recant back to the true path before dying. In this bizarre way of thinking, Mary believed she was giving people a final chance to save their souls from eternal damnation. Some of the first to die would be well-known figures such as the Bishop of Worcester and Gloucester, John Hooper, Lawrence Saunders, and Roland Taylor. Saunders kissed the stake he was tied to, declaring it the, quote, cross of Christ. Taylor's death had a slow start when a local butcher, charged with lighting the pyre, refused to do so. A spectator threw a torch into the pile of wood, but shortly thereafter, a guard named only as Warwick struck Roland over the head with the butt of his axe, mercifully killing him immediately. Following that came the former Bishop of Worcester, Hugh Latimer, and the Bishop of London and Westminster, Nicholas Ridley. They faced the fire together in Oxford on the 6th of October, 1555. Reportedly, as they awaited their death, Latimer said to Ridley, quote, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." I'm not sure how much comfort those words gave Ridley, who died far more slowly than his companion. His death was so long in coming that his brother-in-law eventually threw more wood onto the pyre in hopes of ending Ridley's torture. But, horrifyingly, this only caused his lower half to burn more fiercely and hastened nothing. In a nearby tower, forced to watch the proceedings, was Thomas Cranmer. Remember him? Let me refresh your memory. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury who annulled Henry VIII's first marriage, helped formulate the Church of England, banned Catholicism, and aided in the declaring of Mary as illegitimate. And now he was entirely at her mercy. Already in prison for high treason, Cranmer was tried for heresy on the 12th of September, 1555. He did not deny his actions, but attempted to argue that they were not heretical. His trial was overseen by the Pope, who stripped him of his archbishopric and left him to the mercy of the secular authorities in England. Having literally watched his friends die before his eyes, Cranmer felt, perhaps unsurprisingly, moved to recant his previous beliefs. Thomas publicly recognized the Pope as the head of the Church, decrying his previous acts of helping to establish the Church of England as sacrilegious. He submitted to the authority of the Queen and her husband, accepted full Catholic theology, and declared that there could be no salvation outside the Catholic Church. He took Mass and commented on his pleasure to be back in line with the one true faith. Under the established practice of law, all of these statements and actions would have been enough to absolve him of his crimes and save his life. But under the watchful, resentful, and evangelical eye of Queen Mary, it would not be enough. Against legal precedent, and to the outrage of the public and many of her advisers, Mary sentenced Cranmer to the same fate as his former friends. Dramatically, as he stood upon his execution pyre on the 21st of March, 1556, in Oxford, Cranmer flipped his script, openly refusing the Pope, declaring him Christ's enemy and a leader of false doctrine, again maintaining the Church of England was, in fact, the only true faith. When the fire was lit, Cranmer found the strength to thrust his dominant hand into the fire, stating that it should be burned first for writing his initial recantation and recording lies about the authority of the papal state. Reportedly, he managed to hold it there until it burned completely away, before finally succumbing himself to the flames. For more information on his final speech, keep an eye on my channel, as I have an execution speeches video coming soon. The execution of Cranmer, despite his recantation, flew in the face of canon law, where it was written that repenting heretics were to be reprieved, and this lost Mary many of her core supporters. In the wake of all this, many Protestants fled into exile, but 283 of them would be burned alive before they could escape. This figure was comprised of both men and women, members of the clergy and ordinary people, as well as merchants and senior religious leaders. Sex, power or position could not save anyone from their gruesome fate at Mary's hands. All of these executions took place in public, to the fascination and horror of England's citizens. To Philip's credit, and the only time I will likely have anything positive to say about him, he attempted to put a stop to his wife's bloodbath, realizing that her public support dropped further with each execution. But even her beloved husband could not quench Mary's fervent resolve. Philip left England in August of 1555, returning only once in 1557 to request money from his wife to pay for troops and ships for Spanish wars abroad. Having received what he came for, Philip left, never to return. Shortly after his departure, Mary again thought she was pregnant, but no baby ever came. Mary would die the next year, perhaps of uterine cancer, after a painful illness. When news of the Queen's decline began to spread, Londoners prepared themselves for celebration. The announcement of her death came just after 7 a.m. on the 17th of November, 1558. Bells pealed throughout the city, and it was said that common folk danced in the street. Mary was succeeded by her younger sister, Queen Elizabeth I, who would, almost immediately, attempt to clean up the religious carnage her sister had brought down onto the country. It would be during Elizabeth's reign that the infamous epithet of Bloody Mary was first ascribed to Queen Mary I. An English clergyman, theologian, and historian, John Fox, is credited with bestowing the nickname onto the late Queen. In 1563, his published book, Fox's Book of Martyrs, took the country by storm. It was so popular, it could even be found placed in local churches alongside the Bible. This book was a detailed account of the sufferings of Protestants under the Catholic Church, and Mary was a central character. Fox referred to her reign as, quote, the horrible and bloody time of Queen Mary, first associating the word bloody with her name. Think of it as one of the first viral hashtags. I wonder if Fox would be impressed to know that this singular description of Mary would so successfully cement the idea of Catholic cruelty, religious tyranny, and bloody deeds in the minds of the public that we'd still be using it to describe her nearly 5 centuries later. But, as brutal as she may have been, and as horrific as these mass executions were, compared to other English kings and queens, just how bloody was Mary, really? Here are some facts and figures to put it into perspective. Mary's father, King Henry VIII, is perhaps best known for his interesting personal life rather than anything he achieved as king. His brutal and bloody history is usually the first thing many people learn about him, and with good reason. Henry's death toll throughout his 37-year reign lies somewhere in the tens of thousands. An oft-repeated figure is 72,000 deaths. However, modern scholars estimate a more realistic, yet still not great, figure of about 600 to 700 executions per year, bringing his total to a bit below 24,000. His death toll includes 3 abbots, 3 barons, a viscountess, 2 viscounts, 3 earls, a countess, a marquess, a duke, and 2 queens. What a busy guy. Mary's sister, Elizabeth I, would go a fair way in balancing out the religious ideological scales, executing an estimated 200 Catholics during her rule. Less excitable than her father, her death toll veers from 800 to a few thousand over the course of around 45 years, mostly made up of traitors and rebels. If we go back further, William the Conqueror's harrying of the north, begun in 1069, resulted in the death of an estimated 100,000 people, the majority of whom were deliberately starved to death. In some places in England, 75% of the population was wiped out on his orders. Then, of course, you have Richard the Lionheart, actively leading a crusade that cut bloody swathes across the continent, at one point massacring nearly 3,000 people in a single event. Or the king's leading armies during the Wars of the Roses, the dynastic civil wars that ripped the country apart for decades and left over 100,000 people dead. And for fun, if you want to call it that, I will point out that between her accession to the throne in 1952 and the outlawing of the death penalty in the UK, 100 people were executed during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, just more than 1/3 of Mary's total. So, truthfully, Mary's bloody reputation can be ascribed to two different things. Firstly, the painstaking reconstruction of her public image as carried out by Protestant factions, beginning immediately upon the accession of her sister to the throne, and secondly, Mary's preferred method of execution. As I mentioned before, executions were a public event and were considered a type of entertainment, as well as sending political messages and proving the consequences of lawlessness. But it would seem that our Tudor ancestors really did see a difference between an execution by public hanging or beheading and the slow burning of a person at the stake. It would be interesting to know, had Mary simply beheaded her Protestant enemies, would the public backlash have been so strong? Maybe. Maybe not. There are firm camps on either side of the historical aisle. Those who view Mary as an angry, bitter woman who sought vengeance at whatever cost, to the detriment of not only her cause, but her very self. And those who support a more rehabilitated image, one of a Tudor trailblazer, the first to prove that a woman could rule with the same authority as a man. I suspect, as is often the case, that the reality lies somewhere in the middle. Mary was hard-working and took her job as queen seriously. A Venetian ambassador recorded that she would rise, quote, at daybreak, when, after saying her prayers and hearing mass in private, would transact business incessantly after midnight. And it's worth repeating here again that she believed the burnings she ordered were a way to save the souls of her people, however misguided. Under Mary's intelligent and politically adept rule, the English navy was restored, crown revenue was increased, and new markets for English exports were developed across the globe. During her reign, 5 hospitals were re-endowed, and statutes to regulate the construction and manufacture of goods and wares were passed. The authority of local government was increased, and she worked to improve the education of the clergy. She was known to be charitable, loyal, and steadfast in her convictions. And, to be sure, her accession to the throne changed the rules of the monarchy. The first English queen to rule in her own right was more than up to the task, and her steady hand and iron grip kept control over her nation, which then passed into the open hand of her sister, whose gender and capability to rule as a woman was never questioned thanks to her sister's pioneering reign. So the question of whether Mary was truly bloody is hard to answer. The woman who led the only successful coup in 16th century England who, while supported by both Protestant and Catholic factions, eluded capture and mobilized a counter-movement to successfully claim her brother's crown, and who laid the foundations for the naval expansion and fiscal reforms that would be claimed as the successes of her sister, Queen Elizabeth, was also the woman who unrelentingly sentenced her theological opponents to a brutal death, refusing to give leniency even to those who recanted their supposed heresies, lost the city of Calais to the French, tanked her popularity with an ill-advised marriage, and managed to lose nearly all of her support in her short 5-year reign. In an age of branding, taglines, and hashtags, I guess we could say that Mary I was effectively cancelled, and perhaps with good reason, turned into one of history's longest-lasting memes. And although Bloody Mary does have a certain ring to it, especially when I'm at the bar, I think it's fair to say that she was no more or less bloody than many of the kings who came before her, or the sovereigns that came afterwards.
And in the future, who knows what we'll be calling Elizabeth II or Charles III? Feel free to put your suggestions in the comments below. Thank you to Queen Mary I, who paved the way for England's queens to rule in their own right, to John Fox, whose Book of Martyrs enabled the creation of this video, and of course to you for watching. I'm Margot Moore, wishing you goodbye and good times.